Well, hello again. I thought I'd talk about something slightly different in this podcast, and it's kind of I suppose, a subset of what I've been talking about in some of the other podcasts related to wildlife photography specifically. But this doesn't necessarily apply just to wildlife photography. So, what I'm talking about is how to photograph subjects that are fast. So, what I mean by that is generally a subject that is moving quite quickly. So an example of that you may have seen in my photographs is a breaching humpback whale. So you definitely want a high shutter speed, and if you want to freeze the action, and that's one way of shooting fast. But an alternative might be to photograph, say, a car if you're at a motor racing event. And in that kind of photograph, you might want to convey a feeling of speed by having some parts of the photograph blurred with your subject frozen, or alternatively, the background might be frozen and your subject might be moving. So shooting fast subjects, as I say, goes beyond wildlife, and there are a few things to think about if you want to do that. And if you haven't done it before, I'd suggest that you experiment, because it is quite a good thing to be able to do, depending on what kind of photography you do. And you can have some fun with it as well. You can be quite creative with how to get movement into photographs. So the first thing I want to talk about is shutter speed, because broadly speaking, shutter speeds will give you certain effects. So if you're looking at thousandths of a second as your shutter speed, that is likely to freeze the action completely, obviously depending exactly upon what you're photographing. But generally, if you're shooting thousandths of a second, you're going to freeze the action completely. So you get one of those moments in time, let's say with something like a whale breach, where you've got water drops that's frozen in the air. You completely freeze that moment in time. If you drop down to hundredths of a second, you start creating room for movement to occur. And one of my favorite shutter speed settings is 1/125th of a second. It's the shutter speed I used to use. These are back in the days of film, but definitely the sort of shutter speed I would use when I was photographing racing cars. I did a little bit of that at different events. So what happens there, and you need to track, so I'm going to talk about that. But if you want to freeze the vehicle but have that movement in it, so things like blurring caused by the wheels rotating and the blurred background because the vehicle has moved a certain distance while you've been exposing it, you want to be down at that kind of shutter speed. And again, I recommend that you experiment with it to see what works for you. Cars are really easy to experiment with, because most of us live somewhere where there's a road and cars going down it. So it's very easy to just experiment with different shutter speeds and see what kind of effects you can get, both by tracking and not tracking the vehicle. If you go slower than that, once you start getting down to tenths of a second and then seconds, you're absolutely creating these images which have a lot of movement in, but the movement begins to cancel itself out, if that makes sense. So you get these more ethereal looking images. So an example of that might be a stream or a river that's moving relatively quickly. And again, if you have access to something like that, it's great to just go along and try photographing it at different shutter speeds. But as you slow the shutter speed down, what you'll begin to do is create more of a kind of blurred a subject being the river or the stream, or a waterfall if you've got access to a waterfall, and you'll get very different results, and the images will have a very different feel. So how you work with speed is definitely a factor in your creative contribution to your photograph. You can make quite an ordinary subject something that people will look at twice or even study, be drawn into as a view of it they haven't seen before. So that basically is shutter speed. And one of the things I will say, that whatever you're shooting, do try and do test shots before you're committed, before the subject you really want to get is in your viewfinder. So do take test shots to make sure that you've got a good exposure and that you're getting, as far as you can, the kind of result that you're looking for. Now, that brings me on to another aspect of the photography with your camera. And if you've listened to me speak before, and I'm pretty sure I did a podcast on this a while ago, and I definitely talk about it in webinars, and that's understanding the modes on your camera. And the modes allow the camera to do some of the work for you. So it will calculate certain settings to get you a good exposure. But also you can retain some creative control or complete creative control or no creative control. So do understand the modes on your camera. And the two that are most relevant to this kind of photography are shutter speed priority and aperture priority. Now you might think, well, if shutter speed is most important, then why isn't shutter speed the priority? But you might be concerned about things like depth of field, particularly if you're freezing the action. You may or may not want your background in focus or out of focus. If you're photographing at the slower shutter speeds I mentioned, so say at the 1/125th shutter speed, your depth of field is probably less relevant because you're already creating a lot of blur. And even if the background is initially in focus, as you move your camera, if you're tracking a fast moving subject, you're going to blur the background anyway. So this is where there's not an absolute right or wrong here. And you really need to work with what is most comfortable for you and what is most likely to give you the result you want based on the subject that you're shooting. So personally, I prefer to use aperture priority, but if I'm working to a particular shutter speed, so I want to be in the thousandths, for example, I'll just make sure that for the aperture and the ISO setting that I'm using, and it might be a range of aperture settings, I'll just check the shutter speed that results in while I'm doing test shots, just to check what I'm getting in that light. And remember, if you're photographing something that is moving, then the chances are that the light, how well lit your subject is, will vary as it moves through the range that you're tracking it. So do be aware of that. So what if it's in a bright area, you might, for example, with an aperture priority of f8, get a shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second, but as it moves into a darker area, that might drop down to 1,000th of a second or even lower. So do have a play. Try some test shots just to see what you can get if you get the opportunity to do that. Often I found there is the opportunity to do that as I arrive where I'm going to be taking the photographs, and then I just recheck it, particularly if I'm in golden hour, which is that hour after sunrise and that hour before sunset, where the light levels begin to change fairly rapidly. So you do need to remember that if you are using a mode, to recheck your settings periodically at least, and possibly quite frequently, to make sure that you are still getting a good exposure. Because with a good exposure, you've got a lot of options when it comes to post-processing and cropping, which is something else I want to talk about. But if your exposure is off, you can find that those options might be quite limited, and you very quickly get images that look quite grainy, or they're not sharp enough, or whatever it might be. So do always keep an eye on correct exposure. That's probably the most important thing to do. Now, I'm going to talk about factors that will influence what you get. So this comes down to what is moving, and sometimes it's quite a lot of things. So if again, coming back to a breaching whale, if you're lucky enough to go whale watching and you want to capture a breach and you want to absolutely freeze it, I always use a very fast shutter speed. So I'm always in the thousandths of a second. And the reason that I do that is that with something like a humpback whale and you're photographing it from a boat, you have to remember that obviously the whale is moving because it's leaping out of the water, and that whole breach process can be as short as a couple of seconds. You know, sometimes if that, because if it's a short breach, it will only be up for a few moments really. So you've got to be very fast. The chances are the platform you're on, so the boat, is also moving. Depending on how rough the sea is. You might be in a dead calm where there's very little movement from the boat, but equally you might be in quite rough conditions, in which case there'll be a lot of movement from the boat. So that's a second factor to consider. And then thirdly, doing things like breach shots, unless you're very lucky, they quite often don't pop up where your lens is pointing. They don't pop up in the viewfinder straight away, or I guess on the rear screen if you're using one of those cameras. So you need to be ready to pivot fast and get that shot. And you get that speed through a lot of practice. That's the only way to do it. But of course, that means that you're also moving. So your subject, your platform, and you are all moving in that moment that you're taking the shot. So hence, I always go for what on the face of it might look like a kind of much higher shutter speed than you would expect, but that's the reason why. Alternatively, let's say you're photographing cars, the vehicle might be moving. So that scenario where you want to keep the vehicle and possibly the driver nice and sharp if you can see both. So this might be motor racing. This also could apply to things like football or some other sport where you want to freeze the person, but you might have other movement in there. But where you're following your subject, you might be pivoting. So in the case of a vehicle, in a car, that's probably going to be on a flat line. So it's just a single line across your field of vision. So you're going to be pivoting as you take the shot. And so really the only things that are moving are the vehicle and you. But if you get your pivot right, you're tracking with the vehicle, so there won't be any movement. And obviously, because you're using a slower shutter speed, as I've recommended, so that you blur the background, you blur the wheels, it is important that you get your panning speed correct so that you absolutely match the vehicle. Otherwise, everything's going to be blurred. Now, that might work. It doesn't mean that that's wrong. But it may. But if it's not what you're going for, then you obviously do want to try and just pan with the vehicle. So again, that ability to handle that technique comes with a lot of practice. So again, it's a question of practicing when you can. Now, if you're doing the opposite, where you want the vehicle to be blurred and the background to be still, which probably means that only the vehicle's moving in that scenario, then that's much easier because you can, only one thing is moving, you're standing still. You can even use a tripod or something. So that starts to give you a lot more flexibility. You can try much lower shutter speeds than perhaps you would if you're in a hand holding the camera. I'm not speaking well today. That might be the kind of situation where you really want to drop the shutter speed down. It might be tenths of a second. Now, that might seem exceptionally slow, but if you're in a low light situation, so it might be an evening or a morning shoot, then it may well be that to get the other kind of factors that you want, or maybe that's what you want, but you might be looking at a much slower shutter speed. So that might have the vehicle completely blurred through the frame. And here you're starting to look at light trails as an example. So you've no doubt seen those shots of vehicle light trails in a city usually, or on a road anyway, where the light trails are going right through the frame. So that would be taken by a camera, usually on a tripod, something like a tenth of a second. So you adjust your other settings. Sorry, that was me hitting my notes. So you adjust your other settings to make sure that you can sustain that particular shutter speed, and that will give you the results. So shooting things that are moving don't have to be fast, but that you can get a variety of different results. So another thing to think about is your framing. So one of the nice things to do, particularly if you are freezing a subject, is to visually give it space either in front of it or behind it, because that starts to lead to telling a story. So you may have heard me talk about being a visual storyteller. If you leave space in front of your subject, whether it's a vehicle or an animal or whatever, you're basically suggesting that subject is going to move into that space, that whatever's important to that subject in that moment is ahead of them. Equally, if you put the empty space to behind your subject, so let's say your subject is looking out of frame to the right and you put a lot of empty space behind it on the left, that suggests that there's something going on behind it. Now, it might be that something that's just happened in the past. There might be a threat or something coming from that side that it may not be aware of. but you're visually kind of suggesting possible scenarios for that situation to whoever is looking at that image. So this is, again, where you can make an image a bit more interesting by just changing the composition slightly. So you might create that composition straight off through the viewfinder. Or if it's something that's happening very quickly, let's say an animal hunting another animal, so that's going to be all happening very quickly usually. It might be, again, the breaching whale, it might be dolphins, porpoising, it might be something like that. Often when you take the shot, you've got to do it so fast to capture the subject that you don't really get much time to frame it. So the framing will tend to happen in post-processing. So if that's the situation, then what I recommend is that you actually pull out, assuming you've got a wide lens, a zoom lens rather. So pull out from the subject so that the subject is smaller in the overall picture. But that gives you more cropping options when it comes to creating the final image. So I always shoot raw. I always shoot with the highest resolution, the biggest picture that the camera will support. And that's one of the reasons I do that, because if I get into that situation, I tend to use zoom lenses anyway, so I'll just pull back a little bit. So my subject is initially smaller in the frame than it will be in the final image, but it gives me those opportunities to just recrop it in a more creative way and create a more interesting photograph with that subject. Now, I've spoken about tracking your subject, and obviously if you're going to do that, it's really important that you focus on it. And this now comes back to how do you use the autofocus on your camera. So there's two things that I do. One is that I always go for a single point focus. Usually it's the center point. So if you look at the autofocus settings on your camera, the chances are that you're going to see something that looks like a collection of little squares. And they're in a larger group of squares, which might be a big block kind of horizontally, and there might be a vertical block in the middle, so there might be a kind of very rough kind of T-shape made up of these little squares. And you might also see markings around them that tend to group those squares. This is basically how the camera is going to focus, but you need to understand what those points mean. So how do you select a group? How do you select all of them if you're going to do a very broad focus? Or how do you pick out one particular point? So as I've said, by default on my camera, I've set my autofocus up to just use the central point. The second thing I do, though, is I don't use the shutter button to set my focus. So normally, what you'll have by default on your camera is when you press the shutter button halfway down, that causes the camera to set the focal point. So whatever you're looking at and however you've selected your points, whatever's in focus on those points is where the camera will set its focus, which is great if that's what you want to shoot. But if you don't necessarily want to shoot that, that can cause a problem. So one of the areas where this can be problematic is if you're photographing something that's quite small, let's say a bird flying in the sky, or there might be buildings or other things, trees behind it. If you don't have your focus exactly on the bird at the time you take the shot, it's going to be the camera will refocus on whatever's on that central point. So that might be a building, a tree, or something else, but you're likely to end up with an out of focus subject. So a way around that is to use back button focus. And what that means is that you reprogram one of the buttons on the back of your camera body to set the focus. So rather than pressing the shutter button halfway down, you'll press a button on the back of your camera. Now, certainly I would imagine all pro cameras allow you to do that these days, and a lot of semi-pro. So you'll just need to check if that's possible on the camera that you're using. It will all be on your camera body. But do look up back button focus and try it out. Initially, it can be a bit tricky to use, but again, with practice, it can become second nature. Now, the other advantage to back button focus is that once you've set your focus, as long as your subject isn't moving too far either towards you or away from you, it means that focal point is pretty much right, and you can compensate for that by just altering the depth of field as well. So it gives you a kind of focal, a box that's in focus, an area that's in focus that you want to keep your subject in. It means that you can just shift the composition so that your subject is no longer has to be on that central point, because once you've set your focus, you can forget about it and shoot away, as long as that focal distance hasn't changed significantly and put your subject out of focus. I hope this is all making some sense, but it is worth looking into back button focus if you find that you're having problems using the standard focus setup. Even if you're not having a problem with it, having back button focus does give you a few more creative opportunities in terms of how you compose your shot if you've got time to do that. So I suggest that's definitely well worth looking into. Another thing to think about is burst, because often with something that's moving very quickly, and here I'm thinking of dolphins, but also I do this with whale breaches and anything else where an animal is moving fast. You are likely to have shutter options. So do you take a single shot? Do you do a small burst? Do you do a large burst? Do you do it a slow burst where you're not shooting very quickly, or do you just go full out and as fast as the camera will do? So generally I go for the highest speed burst that the camera will support, and go for as long a burst as I can. Now sometimes, depending on how big your images are, you'll find that the burst duration, the number of photographs that the camera will take with the button held down, shutter button held down, is quite limited. So I find this on one of my Canons with a very large image size. It can only write so fast the cards in the camera. With a smaller file size, then I find that the burst speed and duration are very high. So again, for things like porpoise and dolphins, where they're jumping in and out of the water, fraction of a second they're visible, the only way to get a shot is to just set up an area in front of you that's in focus, and then hold that button down and burst away, and you're going to shoot a lot of images that are terrible. But if you're lucky, you'll get one or two that are absolutely right. But for subjects that are moving very fast like that, it's pretty much impossible to set up a shot in the way you normally would for, let's say, a static subject. So, that pretty much covers it. I would say, whatever you do experiment with this, but practice a lot, particularly if you're going somewhere for a vacation, or it's a kind of trip that you may not get the opportunity to do again. Really make sure you practice as much as possible. Depending on what it is you do want to shoot, birds are a great subject for wildlife. Moving cars, generally, most people have access to photographing moving cars, and then you can just practice and try different settings. So the kind of settings just in terms of aperture, I'll tend to start at f8 as a starting point, because that's pretty much down the middle of the aperture range for most lenses. And if you're working with a cheaper lens, that's generally where it will perform the best. For pro and semi-pro lenses, it doesn't make a lot of difference. The performance of the lens at the extremes of aperture should be very similar, but if there's any doubt, keep to the middle of the aperture range. So I would certainly do that. Okay, and that, frankly, is pretty much that. The only thing I haven't really spoken about is whether you add blur or remove it in post-processing. So I'm not a big fan of adding blur. The reason, this is my opinion, is that it's very easy to make an image start to look like it's been over-processed a bit in post-processing. So I try and avoid that. I tend to keep my post-processing process system to as limited as possible, because I really want to keep the shot as natural as possible. I'll do adjusting for light and color, those sorts of things. I'll definitely recrop to get a more interesting composition, but beyond that, I don't do very much. There is a program you can use from Topaz Labs that will remove movement in an image, if that's what you want to do. If you've got a shot that you do want to process and is perhaps slightly out of focus, and it's one of those shots you absolutely love, but it's just not quite there. That's I can't remember what the costs are for those. They're not so cheap, but it may be something that you might find that you want to use a lot, or not that much. So the post-processing side I haven't really focused on very much, and I'll kind of leave that to you. So I hope you found that interesting. I hope you found that useful, and enjoy your photography. I'll speak to you next time. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.